Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is April 17th, 2006, 8:13 a.m. So, again, I've been doing these oral history posts and interspersed, I did a series on Brian O'Leary, again, did posts on Ralph McGehee and others that I met, encountered related to the timeline again in my journey. And sometimes I think it might be easier for my readers and watchers if I group something thematically. So I do this some. I'll do it more also when covering American history or again I started a medical racket thread. Um, this is going to be an organized suppression and spook uh, series that I'm going to do in the middle of this, and basically how I came to learn what I learned about this aspect of trying to make the biggest event in the human journey come to pass. This is the spook world, organized suppression definitely comes with the territory, and how to say it, I don't. I think it gets very overemphasized, particularly around the conspiracist crowd. And of course, with the structural crowd, they deny it. They deny this thing happens, and the conspiracist crowd gets all in a lather about these issues with, again, kind of a tabloid orientation to it, again, such as fake moon landings, which I recently did a video on that. No, we really landed on the moon with conventional rockets, all that happened. Also, the spooks had anti-gravity, quite longer I've been alive. And so we didn't, how to say it, humanity didn't need to go to the moon with conventional rockets. The tech exists to obviate that, but which I'll cover more. But anyway, so I'm going to be doing a series of posts here on organized suppression, spooks, related matters, and particularly how I came to understand these issues. How that, how did I learn these things? Wasn't fun. So, particularly when you're targeted by these activities. And it took me many years of having experiences, these various experiences, hearing fellow travelers speak, trade notes with them, and for me to construct the picture of how I see things in these areas. And I think that for the people I seek, this series of posts is going to show the connections between them. So it's seemingly disparate set of events, etc. They were all how to say it. In my mind, I eventually connected them. I saw, and you can't see it all, particularly once it's covert. Again, it's so secretive, and so it's really difficult to really understand the big picture. And the people who do, people who've played at those levels, it's life risking. Lots of lives have been shortened, shattered. And again, I was somewhat involuntarily um, brought into this world, brought in that aspect of this world. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to get into it. And then this first post is just going to be sort of the background before it got intense. Um, as I've written plenty, mentioned about it. So my father, he spent his whole career working for the federal government and worked for the Navy. And when we got recruited to work in NASA's Mission Control Room, he had to get a top secret security clearance. And just like Brian O'Leary did. So Brian O'Leary had to get a top secret security clearance to become an astronaut. And part of the background, in fact, they both, my father and Brian, discussed this, were literally part of the background check back then. I don't think it's that intense today as it used to be back then, but they'd actually go look up your first grade teacher and talk to your first. They talked to your first grade teacher about you. Yeah, this is how they did it back then. And my father worked on, again, I was raised in Ventura County. The biggest employer in the area was the U.S. Navy. There were two naval bases there, Port Hueneme and Port Magoo. Um, and I only visited them uh, basically during they have an annual open house essentially for these bases, like an air show. Like the Blue Angels would just come. So I grew up watching the Blue Angels every year fly over, and then they had naval demonstrations, literally years, so these grandstands, and there's the ocean. And I remember seeing like, I think missiles going off or something, but anyway, they're showing off their capabilities, military capabilities. And so I was raised in a basically a military household in a militarily dominated community in the greatest empire there's ever been during the height of the Cold War. So I was raised with Cold War ideology, and going up my family tree for a century, um, all my ancestors were soldiers. My one grandfather was in World War One. Uh, shouldn't have survived it. In fact, he was in mustard gas. He was in the trenches there in Europe. Mustard gas attacks. In fact, he got the influenza that swept the world back then. And I've I've said this before. They figured he was dead, and they threw him into a makeshift morgue for him to only crawl out 3 days later, which freaked everybody out. And he was disabled from that. My other grandfather was in World War II. Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal was the CB, bombing raids every night. Again, should have died. He shouldn't have survived that. Shouldn't have survived the experience. I had my wife's father. He was World War II. Flew the hump there over the Himalayas into southern China. Again, shouldn't have survived. Got a head injury. He was a lucky one. He was the only member of his crew who survived that. And so this was, and men don't come back from war normal. And my father was in the Korean War, came back all messed up. Yeah, you come back either emotional, mental, or physical wreck from warfare. Yeah, men don't come back from war normal. But this is where, when I was raised this idea that I wouldn't quite be a man unless I've been a soldier. And what a terrible thing. What a really, truly terrible thing to raise children under that kind of idea. And this is back to the grim human journey, the grim human past. And so this was, yeah, boys are expected to grow up to become soldiers, defend their societies, and slaughter people and die in the line of duty, this kind of thing. Get an honorable burial, all that stuff. And this goes back to chips. This is very old dynamic. And I almost went to the Air Force Academy. So I went to Boys State, which was again, I was this Boy Scout, Golden Boy, and in high school I went to something called Boys State, sponsored by the American Legion. In fact, I mentioned my moon landings thing. One of the moonwalking astronauts addressed our group. And again, somebody asked him what it was like on the moon, and he refused to answer, actually. So funny, but yeah, so this is lots of strange events like that in my journey. Um, and anyway, so I go to the Boy State experience because that was apparently a big feather in my cap if I was going to apply to the Air Force Academy, and I did, and I actually got nominated by my congressman, and then my mother, who thank God she was looking out for me, so she knew that men didn't come back from war normal, and I think she had a pretty good idea what being a soldier would do to her gentle child. So anyway, so she prevailed on my father to talk me out of going to the Air Force Academy. I'd have been a shoo-in. So, and then I've often thought, what if I'd have been an Air Force pilot? Would I have been, slaughtering Iraqis and bombing their water plants and stuff, killing millions of people? Would I have been a part of that? Could have been. So could have happened. But my life had a different direction to take. In fact, by the time I was 19, I was a pacifist. So all my spiritual studies. But for a brief time there, I was going to become a soldier. Fly boy. Don't have to look the enemy in the eye as I slaughter him, kind of thing. Um, and anyway, so that was my early brushes with that stuff. And then And then what happened when I was a young man, and I can't, and this one I really can't, I'll probably never reveal the identity of my relative, um, who, who, who did this. But I had a close relative who was a contract CIA agent who worked for Henry Kissinger, which I did not reveal that till after Kissinger died. And he was recruited, and and I can't get too much into the details of this, but he was recruited into being a spook. And in fact, I found out about this because I lived with him for a while, didn't know about it, and then after he was no longer in my life, there was an afternoon when his wife sat me down and huh, told me about my relative's secret life and what I had narrowly escaped because he almost tried to recruit me into this so-called business. Um, Yes, this guy was a spook, contract agent. So the contract agent, so again, Ralph McGehee, who I've written about, and I did a video on him not too long ago. He was CIA, but he was in the civil service end of that. He had a GS rating, pension, salary, all this kind of stuff. And even though he was what they call guerrillas, he still was supposed to run the paramilitary stuff. My relative, he was a genuine spook, and he killed people. This is part of what he did. And with contract agents, they actually you wouldn't be full time. You wouldn't be officially on the payroll. In fact, and again, I'll skip around maybe a little bit here. So John Perkins, the economic hitman guy, Confessions of an Economic Hitman came out, about over 20 years ago. Um, when he was in his training to be an economic hitman, it get bad. At those levels, they dispense with all the charade of lying to you and deceiving you. They tell you how it is. You're gonna be a hitman for corporate interests, and that's what he was told. And when he was trained, he was taught that when the United States overthrew Iran's government. Yeah, it's funny. Here we are, war in Iran again. When we overthrew Iran's government in '53, again, Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of Teddy, as I recall, he ran the operation. But after they overthrew the Iranian government on behalf of American oil companies. So again, the Dulles brothers who engineered that were Rockefeller fixers their entire careers. So overthrowing Iran's government was basically on to the benefit of American oil companies. Imagine that. So anyway, but what Perkins was taught was after the overthrow of Iran's government, there was an effort. They realized that they needed to do this more secretively, so they started privatizing it. So, and what privatizing it did was that there was no longer going to be some paper trail in government archives that could be subpoenaed by Congress, et cetera. So this is a way to keep this again off the books, secretive. And this is a trend I've seen over and over and over now, where all this off the book stuff, secretive stuff, secret missions, etc. I mean, all this. I've seen it in special forces. I've seen it in main military with military contractors. Yeah, all this stuff where there's not a paper trail, etc. Stuff that's never been declassified. Probably never will be declassified. Missions I'm aware of that will never be declassified that may not even made it into the records. This is all part of their strategy to make sure there's never going to be accountability to the people, to the public, who's ultimately sponsoring all this stuff, all this mayhem and bloodshed. Um, so my contract agent relative, he couldn't have a career because he kept getting called on to play spook. And so literally he would have a job and then you get the call. They get the call and he'd go off and play spook for a few weeks. Well, he'd lose his job. So he'd come back and lose his job. And he had a handler he would give him money to get him by, and it's for his next job. But then he'd be called on to play spook again. So this guy he really didn't have much of a career because he was so busy playing spook all the time. And it just wrecked him. Yes, he couldn't have a normal life. And so when I knew him, he was deeply in debt. And so this was, yeah, and it was, and some of the, yeah, so anyway, the afternoon when his ex-wife told me about, his other life. Um, one time there was a guy on his team who was suspected double agent, and he was told to kill him, and so he did. But he told his wife that he didn't want to. He didn't, it wasn't like he liked the guy or whatever, but he was suspected double agent. And back then, you kill double agents, so he killed his own guy. Orders are orders, And in fact, this relative, he drank himself to death, and this is normal. And one of the reasons a lot of these contract agents they recruit them with these James Bond Patriot pitches when they're not mobsters, and so also mobsters end up working for the spooks. This is all it's all related and connected. Uh, but what really works great, so they don't hiring psychopaths. They do hire psychopaths, but it's a little more risky because psychopaths go to the highest bidder. They're like, you know, well, break glass to use these assets. But what works out better is if you get these people who believe in the cause, like Ralph McGee did, right? It took him 17 years to finally wake up to what he was involved in, or 16 years to wake up to what he was really doing. And so it is better if they get recruited with these patriot, macho James Bond kind of pitches. Um, and basically they work for psychic income. They believe in the cause, and so they're cheaper. So these people are, again, I think it's covert action on the cheap. That's kind of my take on it. And so yeah, so this was his terrible life. And in fact, the killing double agents, years later, just a few years later, I was reading about Allen Dulles, who ran the CIA, when it overthrew Iran's government. In fact, Dulles was the guy who apparently had Jack Kennedy. He gave the green light for killing Jack Kennedy, which that's what Danny Sheehan reported, which I've talked about, written about. Dulles, they asked him about double. One day, there was some cocktail party, and he said, "What would you do about double agent?" Dulles said, "I'd kill him." So, anyways, that was many years later. I'm hearing Dulles, how he loved to kill double agents, and so it took me back many years. My relative being given the order to kill his own guy because he was a double agent. So, anyways, this is and again, so if you're not a psychopath. And I don't care. I mean, you kill people, whatever, however justified you're being told it is. You don't do that with a clean conscience. And so, anyway, some relative, he basically drank himself to death, which was, that's common. Spooks, special forces, etc. Drinking yourself to death is normal. Yeah, that's normal to deal with that life. It's interesting. So, yeah, so this is years and years before I met Dennis Lee. I heard about this stuff, and it was huh, sobering, I guess, to hear about that stuff. And then, a friend of mine was a teacher called Silva Mind Control. Again, back in my LA days in the '80s, in the early mid '80s. We're good friends. We're still good friends, and yeah. Again, he taught, it was called Civil Mind Control. It was about learning to meditate, etc. And back then, mind control, again, I think the class was named back in the 40s, before the rise of the CIA, etc., before the revelations of MK Ultra, etc. And it was called Civil Mind Control. In fact, eventually it was called the Silva Method. So with the rise of MK, the revelations of MK Ultra and stuff, they renamed it, I think, Silva Method. But it was Silva Mind Control when I took it back in 1974. And anyways, my friend taught Silva Mind Control, and one of his classes, and he would teach classes again there in California, and he'd have classes of, I was in classes, it'd be 20, 30 people. I think that was pretty normal, sometimes bigger, but 40 to 50 was a more normal kind of class size. And after class one day, as he's teaching this class, a guy approached him. Again, this is I think when the class is over, and this guy approached my friend, and he basically told him that he took the class because it said, again, it was called Silva Mind Control, and he was he was wondering if it was related to spook stuff. And when we took the class, I realized it was the opposite of that. It wasn't spook stuff. But anyway, this guy then told my friend, the teacher, he said a little bit of his background. So this guy was CIA, and I think he was more career CIA, probably in the spook stuff. And so he was a spook in the CIA, but he retired again, kind of like Ralph did, retired with a pension, etc. And he had a son, and his son was again a young adult by then. And so anyway, when he retired, he was just gonna play. And so travel the world. And he was on some team. So during his CIA days, whatever this stuff he did, it was spooky. It was spooky kind of stuff he did. Well, when his son, when he retired, they traveled the world. So like 2, 3 years, those two just traveled the world and essentially went off grid. And we're talking, back I think in the 70s, and so this was before internet and electronic things, et cetera. So these guys, yeah, just sort of disappeared. Again, went off the grid. Again, he wasn't trying to; he was playing. And so anyway, after 2 or 3 years of traveling the world with his son, he comes back to the United States and decided to look up his old pals because they were all again at those ages when they were retiring, etc. So he started looking up his old buddies from his CIA days, and it was some unit he was in. As he started looking them up, he found out that they were all dead, all of them, and they all had untimely ends. So one day they're fine, the next day it's a heart attack, or they sudden cancer, or some accident. Again, all these ways to suddenly die. And when he saw that all of his friends were dead, again, all of them unexpected, all these unexpected deaths of all of his friends, he realized that somebody was cleaning up the operation. Yeah, this is so you don't even get a comfortable retirement in some of this stuff. They just kill you when they're done with you. And so anyway, so this guy went underground. He realized that his life was in peril, and he just lucked out traveling the world like he did off the grid. And so he was spared because they couldn't find him. But when he found this out, though, he basically went into hiding, went into probably changed his identity, all that kind of stuff. And so he's telling my friend, the Silva instructor, about this. He said, "Yeah, this is so." The guy was on the run. Anyway, he joined Silva to see if it was related to spook stuff, and it wasn't. But he was, he was. I don't know what his motives were exactly for doing that, but anyway. So, my Silva friend told me this. Again, we're talking over 40 years ago. I'm hearing the story from him. So anyway, it was like, yeah, isn't that interesting? And I was also introduced to the mobster world when I was young. And so this is yeah, so in fact again, yeah, I know more about organized crime than I want, and a lot of these issues it's like learning these things is I think a lot of people think it might be cool to know, but it's how to say it. It's maybe good to know if you're trying to survive in these areas, but it's not fun to know. But there are some kind of fun stories, and so I'll tell the story a little bit of my stepfather. So my stepfather, um, I lived with him for a while, and then my youngest brother was kind of worshiped the guy, and so I heard these. In fact, I mostly heard from my brother because I really didn't talk to the guy a whole lot, and I didn't know him for that long. But but my little brother kind of he was tight. My little brother was tight with the guy, and oh, the stories I hear. So and actually when I lived with him, he he was a musician, entertainer. In fact, I was originally a drummer, jazz drummer. Modeled himself after Buddy Rich, as I recall, and played with Duke Ellington, and he played with the big names. And he was in a band, and again, he grew up as a drummer, and then he was in a band. One of his bands he was in, and he was to be the drummer. But the guy said, "In this band, you got to sing." And my stepfather's named Fred, and so Fred, he goes, "Well, I don't sing." He goes, I'm just a drummer." And they said, in this band, you sing, so sing something." Anyway, so Fred, he sang a song, because they made him. And then when he got done singing the song, they go, "You sound just like Frank Sinatra." So anyway, this guy, anyway, my Fred finds out that he sounds like Frank Sinatra, and well, he became a Frank Sinatra sound-alike guy. And so he actually headlined his own lounge acts there in Vegas, Frontier and the Riviera. And in fact, he knew he was. This is in the Rat Pack days, so he was in Vegas from like '59 to '62, and in fact, also you would do stuff where it was Vegas, Tahoe, Reno, and he would. And in fact, I've seen ads. I looked him up on the internet where he was ads for his act. In fact, he was higher billing than Dean Martin in one of the ads I saw. So anyway, then when I lived with him, he actually played me one of Sinatra's albums. He played a song on one of Sinatra's albums, and he said it was him singing. It wasn't Frank. And he said that yeah, so they did it without his permission. So he was surprised as anybody when he found out that it was him. It was him singing a song that was on the Sinatra album. And they didn't ask his permission for it. In fact, they were concerned that he would sue him or something. But Fred was just flattered, that. In fact, he met Frank, and they had a talk. And again, this thing, "I sound just like you," kind of thing. And Frank just said, "Just sing like yourself. You don't sweat it. Just yeah, don't try to sing like me. Just sing like yourself." They just coincidentally sounded just like Frank. And so anyway, so he was in Vegas there, and had his own lounge act, and lounge acts, and he actually lived across the street from the mobster who ran Vegas in those days. Yeah, it was really, in fact, there's a museum, I think, in Vegas about when the mob ran it. And so yeah, the mob really ran it back in those days. And in fact, Bugsy Siegel, he sort of built Vegas, et cetera. And that's where, again, Gary Ween and Mickey Cohen, these guys roll into this. And that's stuff I learned about a lot later, but this was all part of this milieu. And so anyway, so Fred lived across the street from the gangster who ran Vegas. Yeah, he lived across the street from the guy, and he lived there for like 6 months. And so when you got a lounge act, you're working at night, right? So you're getting up at 3 p.m., etc., right? Well, anyway, so Fred was working, doing his lounge acts, and after he'd been there like 6 months, he finally decided to go walk across the street and pay his respects to his neighbor. In fact, I used to, when I told the story, I used to say Tony. I looked it up, and I think his name was Tony. This guy named Tony who ran Vegas back then. And anyway, and Fred walks across the street, probably with the drink in hand. Yeah, the Rat Pack lifestyle ruined him. Yeah, it was like, yeah, smoking and drinking and showgirls, and yeah, terrible lifestyle, really. Anyway, so he walks across the street, and again, of course, in front of the Tony's house are these two mesomorph, mob bodyguard guys, but they were happy to see Fred come across, and like, "Hey, Fred." So anyway, so they he's welcome, and they welcome him in the house, and they go, "Hey, Tony, he's back there. Go see Tony." So you let him in the house, and this is this cavernous mansion. I think Fred's probably accompanied through the halls, trying to go to meet Tony. And then anyway, so after walking through this cavernous mansion, he goes into Tony's so-called bedroom, and then the bedroom is probably as big as my house. And in the corner, and this is now probably 59, 60, somewhere in there, in the corner in the corner of this so-called bedroom is a hot tub that's sunken into the floor. And this is way ahead of its time. So this is, yeah, but if you were Tony, you actually had a hot tub sunken into the floor. And anyway, so Tony Fred walks into the room, and then Tony's sitting there in his, in this hot tub. I don't know if, I can't remember if he had a woman with him or not, but anyway, so anyway, Fred goes, hey, Tony's like, hey, Fred. He's really happy to see him. He jumps up out of the hot tub and he's stark naked, and he's walking across the room to see Fred. Fred's trying to maintain his composure, I guess. And anyway, and I think Tony eventually puts his robe on or whatever. And anyway, he's just happy to see Fred, and yeah, the mobsters would keep entertainers kind of like pets, and so all the stories of Sinatra and the mob, yeah, they're all true. This was normal back then. And uh anyway, so Tony was really glad to see Fred, and they are chit chatting. And Tony says, "Hey, Fred." In fact, after a few minutes, Tony goes, "Hey, Fred, I need to kiss you." Fred was like, "Here's this naked gangster wanting to kiss me. I need to kiss you on the lips." And so anyways, Fred's kind of like, "Okay." Anyway, so Tony gives him a kiss on the lips, and Tony goes, "Fred, you're in the family now." And so, anyway, so Fred's like, "Okay," a chit chat. Anyway, so then Tony, he goes, "Hey, Fred, your house, have you ever thought about fixing it up or something?" And Fred's like, "Well, I'm busy working, but, one of these days I'll probably, paint it and put a little white picket fence around it, someday." Anyway, so they chit chat some more, and then Fred goes home. And the next night or whatever, he goes to work. And when he comes home from work the next day, his house was painted and there was a white picket fence around it. And so yeah, so this is what it was like if you're in the good graces of Tony, who ran Vegas in those days. And again, mobster. So Dennis, he survived several mob hit attempts. Mobster stole his businesses. Oh, yeah, Dennis survived several mob hit attempts. Shouldn't have survived. I mean, I've spoken about these. I'm not going to, but two hit attempts in Alaska. At least a couple there on the East Coast, one in Jersey, and when he survived one in Jersey, he survived it in a way that he earned the mob's respect, and so they left him alone. That family left him alone after that. Dennis became actually a legend in mob circles for the way he survived the mob hit. Yeah. So I just on the East Coast, I heard my fair share of mob stories, and again, especially from Dennis with his interactions with them. And yeah, so the mob was big back then, back on the East Coast. And again, Dennis and special forces, so his special forces skills actually helped him survive some of the murder attempts. Yeah, so this is that world. So I was, educated, let's say, about that world when I was younger, a lot younger. Yeah, not a world I want anything to do with. And that's, how to say, it's like, well, the guy who runs Vegas is your neighbor across the street. What are you going to do, right? Or Dennis, the mob kept muscling out his businesses and stealing them, and Dennis didn't want that, but Jersey was, New York's the mob turf, so there's small businesses, and again, stuff as meteoric as Dennis was always doing, it always attracted attention by mobsters and others. Global elites eventually were involved, but in the early days, it was just mobsters and local business interests. Yeah. And for me, it's so these are all when I was a young man. This is all stuff, I was in my teens, 20s, right out of school. And when I started my career in Los Angeles, I worked in Skid Row, LA, and I quickly became streetwise. And again, it was hell. I mean, working in Skid Row was like working in hell. I've written about this, and I did in one of the videos. It's like again, during smog season in LA, you couldn't even see the skyscraper I worked at till you're less than a mile away from it. And driving into Skid Row every day was like driving to hell. And so anyway, it was like this anyway. So my morning commute was literally like driving to hell. And after about a month, one day I was driving and I just burst into tears, like I can't do this anymore. And anyway, after that day, it didn't bother me anymore. But my drinking problems began in earnest about the same time. And so, I've encountered this a lot now when, when Americans, white people think they're going to go see the world and they end up going to, nations that are not industrialized. They're shocked, they're shell shocked by the experience, Oh, and so it's just, and then what'll happen is that maybe after a month or so, you get used to it. And this is what, and so I had a similar experience working in Skid Row, LA. So after about a month, you got used to it. And again, one day, the epitome of my LA, those Skid Row days, is one day I'm walking to work, going around a corner, and there's a dead body in front of me. And the woman I was with were walking to lunch, and there's a dead body in front of me, and you just sort of walk around it and go in 50 more yards and go in and eat lunch. And you don't talk about the dead body you walked over. Yeah, you just act like it didn't happen. Yeah, so I've been there. And it's like, yeah, what a terrible world, terrible existence. And people who live, people who live in Skid Row, it's like living in hell. Oh, yeah, I could tell a lot of Skid Row stories. That was really something. Um, and so anyways, those are all events that happened really, before, Dennis telling me stories. So all of that happened before I ever met Dennis. And so I just, again, I was a Boy Scout, raised in a nice suburban beach town, etc. But I was exposed to all this kind of crap when I was young. And I didn't know how to say it. I have this, I almost photographic memory and stuff. So all the experiences instead, I just file them away. And then, of course, with my mind, I'm always trying to, as a scientific, background, etc., you're always trying to make the connections, right? That's how scientists come up with their hypotheses. They have all the evidence they have, and then they try to see what, causal relationships connect them all. And that's what scientists do. And so my worldview has been developed by experience. And then again, those kind of experiences, et cetera, I just follow those away. And then again, many years later. So again, when I read that Allen Dulles loved killing double agents, my mind went back, 40 years or so to my relative who had to kill his own guy who was a double agent. I'm like, okay, that makes sense, And so anyway, so that's a lot of, in fact, in this kind of one of the reasons I'm doing this series on the spooks and stuff is that it didn't all happen at once. The events and experiences and trading notes and stuff happened over many years. And then and something I lived through, and then I'd hear somebody else talking about what they went through that was very similar, and I'm going, oh, that's what was going on with us. Yeah, I didn't know it. Yes, when we got the first $10 million offer, was, a few months after we became Dennis's partner, we got a $10 million offer to buy us out. It was another 11 years later when I learned from Tom Bearden that was the standard friendly buyout offer. Yeah, I didn't know it, and so I didn't know I was a global elite who was making that offer till like 11 years later. And then it was another like 11 years after a big sting operation tried to get us when I was with Dennis in 96, 97, that I realized that it was a sting operation. That what we were being, yeah, it was all this spooky, fraudulent stuff trying to entrap us in a sting operation by saying they're going to give us billions of dollars. Yeah, it was all, if we'd have taken the money, we'd have gone straight to prison because they were going to make it look like it was laundered drug money and that we were somehow running the operation. I'll get into that stuff later. But anyway, so my point is that events would happen, and I'd be like, well, that was strange. And then anyway, it happened a bunch of times where I'm hearing stuff later on, years later, maybe many years later, and then all of a sudden I'm going, oh, now it makes more sense. And I remember in Gary Ween's book, again, him and his he heard, 3 weeks after the JFK assassination that Oswald didn't do it from a frightened Senator John Tower, all this stuff. And again, Gary's reporting has been completely vindicated over the years. In fact, his radical hypothesis is now the mainstream one, and declassified documents just there's no reasonable doubt left that Gary was telling the truth when he said that Oswald was really military intelligence. He was in a backfired CIA operation. which actually the real operation probably was also CIA. And that's another story, which I've talked about before. I won't get into it much now, but I'll cover some of that here in this series of posts. So yeah, so anyway, so this series of posts is intended to bring together so many pieces of data to come up with the mosaic of the world I see around this stuff in particular. I said it to me, again, back to 1% conspiracy, 99% complicity. And this is about the 1% conspiracy part. And even that, there's a lot of structural aspects to that. So a lot of the people who are involved in these activities don't really understand their role either, because these operations are tightly compartmentalized. These people just know to do one thing. They don't see the big picture. They're just out there to do what they do. Yeah, so my relative who worked for Henry Kissinger, I mean, he never figured out he was one of the bad guys like Ralph McGehee did. He probably went to his grave thinking he was one of the good guys, except he drank himself to death because, yeah, at some level he kind of knew it wasn't, killing people was probably not a good thing. Probably, yeah, not exactly a noble thing to do is killing people, especially one of your own who was a suspected double agent. I don't know what due process they had behind those kind of orders. Don't know. Was it a good due process? Was it a bad due process? Does it matter? Yeah, good questions. So anyway, so then again, in my journey, I was full of these paranormal experiences, a voice in my head, after desperate prayers telling me to change my studies from science to business. And another desperate prayer, the voice said, move to Seattle, and I did, and I walked right straight into Dennis's company. Yeah, I can hardly believe it happened. So this was, yeah, my life was, I don't know how much free will I really have. It's like my free will seems to be confined to handling what gets thrown at me in this lifetime as I keep seeking my goal, which is a healed planet, a world of abundance, and love instead of scarcity and fear. That's what I've been going for since I was 15. So we'll see how it goes. I'm not done, not by a long shot. And so when I met Dennis, again, the day I met him, he had a bodyguard for all the death threats he had. And again, the day I met him, he gave a talk in front of 1,000 people with several news camera crews and stuff. And then he was heckled by Bill Delp's attorney. And Bill Delp he worked for the global elite. So he was a hitman for the global elite, kind of corporate hitman. I mean, he was responsible for a woman's death, who one of Dennis's employees, was actually what radicalized Dennis on his quest. But he was his job was taking out threats to markets. So again, Dennis is putting the world's best heating system on people's homes for free. Electric companies in Washington State just saw themselves losing billions of dollars of revenue. That's all they could see. In fact, bad load, back to what Amory Lovins called it. And yeah, so it was just taken out. And then again, Mormons end up stealing our company there in Seattle. And I later learned that Mormons' financial empire is the ringleader of the global elite. And in fact, Dennis, he realized later on that the Mormon financial empire was actually the biggest investor in Washington's electric company. So, no wonder we were taken out like that. Yeah, Dennis was in the lion's den, didn't know it. And in fact, my first big awakening moment during my ride with Dennis is the moment his company was stolen. When the theft became evident that it would succeed, this cheer went up from the crowd, who were mostly Dennis's employees. So they were cheering the theft of his companies. I'd imagine because they thought that means they'd get paid. They didn't get it. They didn't get it. The only man who had the hero of the whole thing. It was a give us Barabbas moment. So it was literally, as Dennis is having these companies stolen, the guy who built it from nothing, as he's getting it stolen, these employees are cheering the theft. That was my big awakening moment, my first one. And again, there was like a dozen of us so-called loyalists that stayed with Dennis, but they all dropped out. And by a couple months later, I was the only guy left. So out of Dennis's hundreds of employees, I was the only who chased him to Boston to help them rebuild. And anyway, it was many years later that I realized that, again, the theft of our company and stuff was probably the coup de grace by the global elite. So just not only wipe the company out, but then steal it. Just make sure that nothing would arise from the ashes. And so this is, in fact, the same thing happened in Ventura, my hometown, a couple of years later. So yeah, this is part of their MO. And again, as I've traded notes, etc., over the years with people that have had similar experiences, it's like, yeah, they use their playbook on us. So there's a playbook, and there's an organized suppression playbook they got, which has a whole series of escalating strategies, and I experienced most of them. Again, Dennis and I experienced probably all of them in the end, including murder attempts. Not me, thank God. But Dennis shouldn't have survived. So Dennis should be dead dozens of times over. So, and then again, I was planning to end this post, and I kind of am, with when I met Dennis. So yeah, so I will get into that wild ride here in the coming post. But again, back to, again, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be talking about the various events that happened, but then I'm going to also bring in events information I learned later, sometimes many years later, that put what we experienced into context. And now we're going, oh, that's what happened. Yeah, so Dennis, in fact, I've educated Dennis on some of this. So he didn't know that there was a sting operation that had targeted us back in 96, 97. It was like, I'm the one who kind of figured that out. And so, but we were, we were too honest for them. Yeah, so if you're really honest, they have a hard time, and, the carrots don't work. They're trying to, and Dennis was too streetwise. He was too experienced to bite, so he didn't bite. So again, when the carrot doesn't work, they use the stick. So anyway, this is how the game's played. And this is stuff that I learned the hard way, and that my fellow travelers learned the hard way. For those who survived, and again, many shattered and shortened lives come with this territory. And and the afterlives of the people involved in the suppression, they're not pretty. But I've been told I got karmic reasons for my journey, helping melt down Atlantis, etc., when I was a younger soul. Okay. Seems to explain my journey, but I have maybe vague memories of it, very vague, but I have some sense of those. So it's like, okay. So anyway, so this is I don't like to think of it as a penance lifetime, but it's a lifetime of trying to make the biggest event in the human journey come to pass. And what comes with that territory is clandestine interests, the ones that run the world, and many other clandestine interests. I said the mobsters and they all operate in the shadows and deception and all this kind of stuff, which is kind of how national governments operate also. So this is where there's a lot of overlap between, again, spooks. So again, the CIA's got a whole, galleries of spooks, and some are, these contract agents, some called off the shelf, where you can plug them right into operations. Then you have people like Ralph McGee who were their career there more as an analyst. So there's this whole lineup, all these levels of this game. And so, yeah, so the rank and file CIA, I mean, almost none of them know or knew that the CIA was involved in the operation that got Jack Kennedy killed. Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't too many people. E. Howard Hunt ran it. Again, John Tower was involved. Prescott Bush was involved. And again, I've written about this JFK a lot before, so I'm not going to get into it right now. But anyway, there's just a lot of various different levels of the game, various different players, and various different competing interests quite often. Yeah, you get turf wars, the spooks have turf wars, and between the FBI and the CIA, and even though they work together more often than they were competing, but all that stuff happens. And so much of it is covered up under the guise of national security, but also a lot of it, again, back to privatizing it, as Perkins was taught, a lot of it never makes it in, goes through the door of the government. It stays privatized. And so, in fact, when my friend was kidnapped and given the underground technology show, that stuff was probably all private, mostly privatized. Yeah, the really good stuff, I think, is almost entirely privatized. The world's governments, even the spook aspects of it, have little control over that. This is Greer's big theme, is that the government, federal government, has no oversight to these activities, and so yeah, it's been completely privatized. There's a spook front door. Again, there's a CIA spook front door, NSA spook front door, but it quickly goes out the back door into the completely privatized world. Good for business. Again, it makes it to where it will never be accountable, anything like a congressional inquiry, et cetera. And so that's when I see, all these congressional inquiries now, and Trump ordering them to release UFO data or whatever. Ha! Yeah, people like me just laugh at all that. It's like, yeah, what do you think? I mean, you may think there's going to be some big, amazing revelation coming out of that. Think again. Yeah, the good stuff will never. Good stuff doesn't is in no danger of coming out in those ways. It isn't. And then people like me, it's like yeah, so I don't even want to know much about my friend's underground technology show. It's like, yeah, I'm sure the people put it on and risk their lives to do it. My friend, yeah, he was wondering if that was the end for him. To me, it's enough to know this stuff exists, and so that's where I am. It's like those technologies do exist. Free energy, anti-gravity technology. These technologies exist on the planet older than I am, and you won't know about it until you start playing at these levels that my fellow travelers and I played at. And then you learn things that you never thought you'd learn if you survive the experience. Again, Brian's life was shortened by the spooks too. So again, this is just comes to the territory. Yeah, so you got to sort of a murder attempt to replay at the highest levels, which I haven't, think, at this point. I'm trying to play the game where I don't. I'm trying to play the game where they don't come for me. Yeah, maybe a foolish approach by myself, but we'll see. But I want to live in a world that's healed. I want to live in a world of abundance and love, or at least help bring it to pass. So that's my game. But anyway, so when you start playing these games, the spooks come running. So we didn't try to engage these people; they engaged us, and so they targeted us. And so this comes to the territory, which can lead to a lot of people get paranoid. Yeah, when they get paranoid, they lash everybody around them, and then they wipe out their best friends. They wipe out their best supporters because they get paranoid and they don't understand that who's who. So they attack everybody around them. I've been attacked in this way, so this is. So anyway, so that's my introductory post on this, and bye for now.